All right, so you're a venture capitalist and you have very clearly made a commitment, including investing in the How Women Invest, only funding women-founded companies. What is your advice? You've seen so many women entrepreneurs and founders. What is your advice to any entrepreneur, but really female entrepreneurs?
I think there's lots of advice, for any founder. When you take money from people, you're getting married to these people. You are going to be working with them for a long time. And if they're joining your board, then you've hired your boss, right? So, which I think is something people don't think about a lot. And for investors are going to do, if they're good investors, they're doing homework about you. They're doing diligence. You should do every bit as much diligence on your investors or board members as they're doing on you to understand what that dynamic is going to be like. And I think for women in particular, I don't think you have to only take money from women, but I certainly, as a woman entrepreneur, wouldn't take money from a venture fund that only had, I'll use a mafia term, made guys who were only guys. It's harder today to disambiguate who the made people are at a fund because everybody's called some form of partner. It behooves you to do your diligence and figure that out. And if you don't have a woman who has a strong voice at the table, I wouldn't take their money. If I were a woman, if they're not going to have a woman as their peer, why would you want them as your boss?
You know what? That is really wisely said. And one of the things I've found when I sort of have been looking around at different funds and sort of saying, oh, well, what women are leading in venture who would be good to align with? And a lot of them are the face person and nothing else. They have no power and influence within the company, within the firm. And so thank you for pointing that out. I think that is such wise counsel. And I think we can often get so desperate for money. And it's like, oh, but you could be my lead or whatever. And then you get in bed with the person, you're like, oh no, not all money is good money. We've all heard that.
And a friend of mine who was one of the earliest female venture capitalists, very successful, once offered me great career advice. And I think this is true for women, no matter what they're doing, is if you can, before you go work for someone, find out what their wives do.
Yeah, interesting.
Right? Because at least for me, if the guy's married to Barbie, it's probably not going to be a great fit for me.
You're not like Barbie?
Not a whole lot, no. Blonde hair, 5'9", the whole bit. I don't fit any of that.
So one of the things in terms of women pitching that we hear a lot of is women aren't pitching and they're not sort of giving the billion-dollar future. And there's something to be said about that inspiring future. But like everything with women, there's a reason that women aren't, because in our society, men are invested in for their potential. Women, it's based on what you've already done. And so one of the things that I always struggle with is, yes, you need to paint a beautiful, bright future. And yet women are actually dinged if they're not seen positively if they are too bombastic, right? That is really in many ways a kiss of death. So where's the line? Do tell us. We need to know, Laura. Give us the perfect
I'm not the Oracle of Delphi. Let me be really clear. I think that's a great question. And I do think a lot of women tend to undersell themselves, right? I mean, women will disqualify themselves from like, oh, I'm applying for a job and it has 10 criteria and I don't meet 12 of those 10, right? And the guy's like, I meet 3 of them, I'll apply, right? So, and
there's a reason, because we know they won't get the job if they don't have, right.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. And I think there are a lot of women, I mean, I don't want to use stereotypes, but there are women who play it safer, right? I can do this and I'm making it because I know I can achieve X, where I think Elizabeth Holmes went way too far. Obviously, I would never encourage anything fraudulent, but, I do give her credit for creating a big vision, right? And there are football fields between creating the small thing that you have control of and obviously painting some big vision that's not real. And I do think it's a balance. I think it's one that you're probably going to have to get feedback on as you're pitching and as you're developing your idea, hopefully from trusted sources, because I really don't think there's a one size fits all. And I do think also, by the way, look, venture capital is the most expensive form of capital there is. Obviously, you're giving up equity and control sometimes and what have you. Certainly control often sometimes with regard to board seats and whatnot. You have to be, as with anything like product or anything related, like how big is the business? How big can the business be? And I think that's true for men, women, anybody. I think that's a hard thing to kind of figure out. And I think the biggest reason venture capitalists pass on investments is markets feel small.
Right.
And so it has to be big enough to justify the long time horizon and the expensive capital. And by the way, it is totally fine to say, I don't have the $1 billion idea. That's totally fine. But get the capital that makes sense for that business.
Right. For whatever you're trying to accomplish.
Whatever you're doing, right?
So we're recording this podcast in early 2023, kind of right in the middle of one of our country's usual market corrections. Like when you're in it, it feels very painful, but you and I have been through this a couple times, a version of this.
Seen some cycles. Yeah.
Yeah. And before this last 12 months, valuations, and even the first quarter of last year, valuations were so outrageous. I'm sort of a believer, if you can step back from it, it's not fun when you're in it. There's pain and losses, but this is kind of a good correction for outrageous valuations and some other things. What is your advice to women VCs and women founders in this environment? If you look at history and you look at what people say, 18 months is the longest we would expect a downturn like this to be, yada, 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 yada. So maybe sometime in September, we should be coming out of this. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I wish I had a better crystal ball, but if I did, I'd be running money on the street and a hedge fund for 2 and 20. But look, I think it's actually a great time to start a company. It's a great time to invest because you're going to have fewer companies started. You have more reasonable valuations. I think more reasonable expectations. I think personally, the growth at any cost, right, which is really what's been taking place for the last decade or more. I don't care how much I spend. It's growth at any cost. I'll buy users, whether, however that is. That suddenly becomes out of vogue. I personally think that that's healthy. And in down markets, I always think about where is demand inelastic. So if I have an entrepreneur I work with who's got a fraud story. I said, well, can you figure out how you sell an anti-fraud story? How do you sell that to a CISO? Because CISOs are still going to have budgets, right? Marketing tech, maybe not so much, right? So obviously, if you're a big established company, by big, I mean startup that's doing 10, 20, 50, whatever million in revenue, and you're a MarTech company, you're not going to move to being a security company. But then you have to sort of plan for, it's going to be a harder time to sell for, I don't know if it's 18 months, 24 months, but let's plan accordingly. Whereas if you are selling toys, for example, are relatively inelastic, right? People always spend on their kids in the consumer base. And enterprises still need to sell, to buy infrastructure and security products, et cetera, because they still need to run. They just may buy less of them. So I think thinking about what market you're in, is there a tweak you can make to get to a place where budgets are less at risk is a good thing.